Sorry, I don't love you. Afraid I've grown accustomed to. Cause with you, something isn't wrong, something isn't wrong.
Hey everyone, welcome to Geekdom is back. This week we are talking all about Stranger Things. And today I have on Derrick, who is a freelance music writer. Derrick, how do you pronounce your last name, just so I don't screw it up?
Yeah, it's French, so I totally get you. It's Rossignol.
Okay, I was going to say it that way, but I wasn't entirely sure. But why don't you tell us a little bit about your freelance writing experience? And I know you specifically wrote about Stranger Things, so this will be a perfect topic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did. I wrote a lot about Stranger Things for Nerdist.com. I was basically like the Nerdist beat writer for like 2 or 3 months after that show came out. So yeah, I write for Nerdist, and I write about TV, music, games, technology, movies, what have you. And I also have bylines at places like the Boston Globe, the Guardian, Paste, the AV Club, Consequences Sound, sort of places like that.
Awesome. And when you were writing about this for Nerdist, did you start writing about it pretty much right after the show dropped, or did it take you a little while to hear about it first?
Yeah, well, I think I'd started actually watching the show itself like a week or so after it came out, because at that point it was starting to be pretty well hyped. People were crazy into it for the plot and the themes and the just sort of 80s feel and stuff, and that seemed cool to me, so I watched it, and I think I knocked it out in probably like a week and a half or so.
Nice. Yeah, I watched it in a much quicker manner. I watched the first episode just randomly one night, and then I enjoyed it so much that the next day I just sat and watched through the next 7 episodes pretty much without moving off of the couch. So I knocked it out in essentially a day, if you consider the fact that I started it at night and finished it in the afternoon the next day. But I found I found it so enjoyable that I was just like, all right, I'm just going to sit here and watch this because I didn't have anything else to do or anywhere to be. So it was convenient at the time. But how did you go about writing for Nerdist with this TV show?
Well, so pretty much, I guess, the nature, excuse me, of the things that I was writing for Nerdist about it was sort of like reaction to news post-show, either like behind-the-scenes info that would come out or things the cast were doing outside of the show. Like, for example, in the course of writing about it, I sort of found that most of the cast is pretty musical outside of the show. Like Finn Wolfhard, who plays. I'm so bad with character names. I should be better with character names for someone who writes about TV, but I'm not. But anyway, he's always like posting songs on Twitter, and there's like a few other who sing and play instruments and stuff. So that was sort of one thing I learned about them outside of the show. So just sort of like trivia type things like that, and just sort of information that is tangent to the show itself. Yeah,
and I know you said, obviously, some of the cast being musical outside of this. Finn appeared in a Pup music video, I believe it was.
Yeah, that's right.
And that was sort of something that was pretty cool because, you know, Pup isn't this huge band, but because I feel like because he was in the music video, it kind of brought in probably some more fans for the band and everything. And I think, you know, quite a few of the kids from the show have been in other things since the show dropped. And I feel like they've had such an influence on what people will check out now just because they go and do these random things. And I think when you have a cast that is so young, and especially for a show that might not necessarily skew towards a younger audience just because of the nature of the show, that's kind of an interesting dynamic that they have going there. And when I first started watching the show, I wasn't entirely sure, you know, the first half of the episodes, the first 4 episodes or so, how they were going to do a season 2 out of this. And then, you know, you hit episode 8, and obviously, spoiler alerts for anyone listening, we are going to definitely talk about the whole show. But then when they have it end with, you know, Will coming back, right? Yeah, Will. And
And then he's just like coughing up tentacles in the bathroom and stuff, and you're like, oh, well, that's a lingering problem.
Right. And it's like he's kind of acting like everything is fine when everyone else is around, and he goes in the bathroom and it just sort of ends and you're like, okay, where are we going with this? And, Barb was sort of, I wouldn't necessarily say a huge fan favorite, but there were a lot of people who sort of clung onto that character. Yeah. And I think, maybe we could see her come back, maybe not. They never really, gave us a body at the end of the season, if I recall correctly. So there's sort of a few different ways they can take this. And I think, they did a good job of not pigeonholing themselves in the first season, assuming it would just be a single season. Because with these Netflix shows, sometimes it's kind of hard to tell if they're going to be these huge hits or if they're sort of just going to be a one-off thing. Yeah. So I think they did a great job with that. But was there anything you didn't particularly like about the show?
I'm trying to think. I guess if I had to pick one thing, it would probably be Barb. So, but then again, there's me. Then there's the people who didn't care for her. So as I said, it was polarizing. I liked her. I should say, even my own view of her is polarizing because I liked her because the function of her character made sense. She was sort of the nerdy sidekick whose friend sort of gets in with the quote unquote popular crew. Just sort of that classic 80s trope thing, which there's a lot of in the show just because it is a big nod to that era. And then when she is taken or maimed or what have you, it's sort of like for the fans who hate her, like, yeah, she's gone, finally, good, I couldn't stand her. But also this is a pretty serious thing that doesn't bode well for Will. So yeah, I don't know. She can draw a variety of reactions out of a variety of people, but I would say I might have just talked myself out of not liking her. She's fine. She serves a function. So I don't know. I guess I couldn't find that many things to root against in the show, which is why I think I enjoyed it so much and watched it as quickly as I did. Not as fast as you did, but but still fast for my standards. Yeah,
and it's sort of one of those shows where you can kind of watch it anyway and it's still enjoyable. You could do what I did and crank it out in a day because it's only 8 episodes, or you can sort of take your time with it and do an episode a day, and you're sort of savoring the experience more that way too, probably. But I think I'm sort of on the same page as you. There wasn't really anything I didn't like about the show. I mean, obviously there aren't really perfect TV shows by any means, but I think they had this idea and they executed it very well. And as someone who has reviewed TV shows, or, I will be once The Flash and Supergirl come back, I've been reviewing those this season. And it's like, I'm not quite as critical as people expect for, like TV critics and that sort of thing. Yeah. I tend to review things that I feel like I'm more inclined to like. I've never really felt the need to review something I didn't like and kind of just spend my time bashing on it, because I feel like that's not really something I want to spend my time doing in general. So I think, a lot of people had plenty of good things to say about the show, and I think that's why it received a season 2 so quickly. And I think, they did an excellent job with the casting too. They didn't try to go out and get all of these famous kid actors and actresses from, like Disney Channel or something that would automatically bring in an audience just because of who they were. Instead, they went and got these kids who hadn't really been in anything, if they had been in anything at all, really. And then, you have Winona Ryder as Joyce Byers, Will's mom, and then you have David Harbour as Jim Hopper, and they're sort of the more well-known actors of the show, but it's not like they're so overwhelmingly popular that they're taking away from what's going on with the kids.
And I think too, what's nice about sort of why that kind of casting works. If you look back at the sort of movies that and shows that this show is based on, like if there's a cast of kids, it wasn't necessarily like huge names that you know already. It's just people who you basically only know as that character. So they're not bringing in sort of other ideas of who the viewer believes them to be. It's very easy to believe them as their own thing and see them as existing only in this universe that you're watching right now.
Yeah, and I feel like that is very similar to, what J.K. Rowling created with Harry Potter. And when you have those actors and actresses come in as kids and they sort of grow up with these movies like we did, it's like they're always sort of going to be known for those characters in some way, even though they are adults and have other things going on now that Harry Potter has finished, at least with the 7 books being turned into movies. And I feel like with this, they have a lot to work with because these kids are still in, probably elementary school, middle school, something like that. So, you can have these kids go all the way through high school and, make this whole big thing out of this one town and all of these weird things happening in this town. And who knows, how many seasons we'll get out of this show right now. All we know is that there is definitely going to be a season 2. And what do you think about season 2? Do you have any ideas of what they're going to do? I know they've made some casting additions, but I haven't really heard much about, the plot or anything like that. So do you have any theories or anything like that?
I don't know about theories, but what I do think, I do think that they do have a lot of options going into the next season. Because while obviously the sort of main plot line was what was taken care of in the first season, there's a lot of, like we said before, problems or issues or just themes that sort of linger and weren't fully closed off. Like, I imagine they would explore sort of the aftermath of Will's whole ordeal. Like, he's still coughing up weird dark side, whatever body parts and whatnot. So he's obviously still being impacted by what happened in a very tangible way that they would just have to explore in order for this story to advance in a way that makes sense. And I forget when they said it, but the show's creators did say that there would be some sort of justice for Barb in this next season, whether that's just the characters saying that, like, yeah, this actually happened, or if she comes back, or if she gets, I don't know, whatever else could possibly happen to her. So there's that angle. There's the angle of the whole dynamic in between Nancy and Jonathan. That seemed like it ended in kind of a strange way of her going with the bad boy, who I guess kind of turned good towards the end.
Right.
But there's still that tension there to deal with. There's still Hopper dealing with the scientist and that sort of creepy shadow or the organization. So I mean, even just based on those 4 angles, and I'm sure these new characters they're bringing in will introduce more. It seems like there's still plenty of this universe for them to delve into and explore.
Yeah, and while they haven't really announced much plot-wise, they did release episode titles for season 2, and obviously some of them will probably change just so they didn't give too much away, but it looks like season 2 is going to be 9 episodes instead of 8, so it'll be interesting what they do with an extra episode added in there, because I know a lot of people who have been following some of the Marvel Netflix shows or even some of the other Netflix originals, their main complaints have been, the seasons are too long. They don't necessarily need to do these 13 episode seasons for every single season of a Marvel show. And I think somewhere between 8 to 10 is sort of the sweet spot right now for these Netflix originals. And I think them just only adding a single episode is a good sign that they sort of realize this is what's working for them. And we saw so much happen in these first 8 episodes, right away in the first episode, Will is taken. And it's like, we don't even really get to see that much of Will's character in general. It's like, he's the main person of the story, and he's not even in the story for the majority of it. So it'll be interesting to see how they sort of develop Will's character in season 2 and what happens, with all of that, because he vanished in episode 1 and they didn't get him back until episode 8. So you have sort of these 6 episodes in between that's focused on Will in a sense, but you're getting so much more of all of the other characters that we definitely probably want to see more of Will in season 2. And I think it's safe to say that a lot of people liked Winona Ryder as the mom, and she sort of played the frantic, paranoid mom very well. And I think that character sort of really, really fit well with the casting.
And I think those 2 characters that you just mentioned will probably be, I think, the most interesting going into this next season, because as you said, Will was sort of like, he was a main character, but not really. And even though he's a part of this core group of main characters who we followed mainly during the first season, and he's part of that main squad, we don't really know much about his personality. Like, we've only seen him interact with those kids not that often, like in the first and last episodes, pre and post ordeal. So. And it was hard for Will as a character to show off any character traits, because he was just kind of panicked and worried the whole time, which obviously makes sense given what he was going through. So it'll be interesting to see what he actually is as a character.
Yeah, and I definitely want to touch on 11 as well, because that is the character they really took time to develop and give her a lot to do, because when we first see her, she doesn't talk to anyone. She just sort of takes Eggos and eats them all. And she is definitely this weird character to begin, and then as she starts hanging out with the boys, they sort of kind of get her to this place of normalness until, obviously the scientist comes back and everything, and Hopper in the final episode does give up Elle's locations just so he can go save Will from, this upside down forest type thing that he's in. And it'll be interesting to see what happens as far as what happens with the scientist and Elle in season 2, because, obviously she had been experimented on and all of these sorts of things, and we saw glimpses of that. They were putting her in this tank and everything, and they touch on it in season 1, but I sort of want to see a little bit more of that in season 2, because I feel like we still don't have this full picture of 11 and sort of what she's capable of. And we see a lot of that, when the boys are getting into a fight with these bullies, and, one of them goes over and Elle somehow kind of like levitates him back to the road and everything. And I think there's just so much that they can work with there as well, that it'll be interesting to see if they sort of hash out more of those details in season 2.
And also with her, kind of a like thing with Will, it'll be curious to see now that she's sort of in less of a state where she's always threatened. It'll be curious to see what sort of personality emerges with her, and I think that's actually the case for most of these characters who we saw in the first season, because now that in this next season they won't be so much in the thick of this big drama and always being under constant threat. They'll have more room to sort of breathe and exist as people going about a more normal, or as normal as it can be after that kind of life. So it's like we know these characters, but only in an environment that very much impacts how they're going to behave and interact with their world. So we know them in one facet that probably isn't true to how they are in terms of personality, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. And I think with them being these young impressionable kids as well, a lot can change just from this single experience that they've had with Will going missing and then finally getting him back. And I'm sure, you know, the boys have a ton of questions for Will, and we'll sort of see how much Will reveals in season 2 as well, because while we did see the Upside Down, I feel like we didn't really get much of an understanding of it. It's like, okay, we know this is a place, we sort of know what happens here, but we don't really know why or how this thing exists. And I think, you know, like you said earlier, they have so much to work with for season 2. And I sort of just want to touch on what you brought up earlier about it having a very 80s feel. And I think that excited a lot of people because, you know, we have movies and everything that people grew up with in the 80s and 90s that sort of define their childhood and everything. And while, you know, I was not around in the 80s, I have watched some of these movies and everything, and it definitely got that feel down very well. But what do you think about it sort of being influenced by Steven Spielberg and even Stephen King books and, you know, those being adapted into movies and everything having a similar feel? Because I've read quite a few Stephen King books, but not a lot by any means. So it's like, you know, the handful that I've read, you definitely get that sort of science fiction horror vibe in a lot of his books. And I think Stephen King might be a little disappointed he didn't write this, you know, and same with Steven Spielberg. So you get a lot of these different types of writers, directors, producers that sort of could have done this. So what do you think about that idea and sort of taking this back to a different time?
Well, I was sort of pondering this today earlier, and it reminded me of this video I watched. It's probably like a couple months ago, and it was actually about games, but it I think it also that applies here. I believe it was a video by this guy called Mark Brown. He has this series called Game Maker's Toolkit where he looks at games old and new and really breaks down why they work and what makes them work. And he was talking about modern games that are inspired by like games from the 80s. And what he was saying is that the reason those work, or rather the reason that the ones that do work is because they don't try to emulate the things that were being made back in the 80s, but it emulates our perceived experience with those things. So it copies those things, but with a layer of the gloss and nostalgia that we look back on, and sort of copies how we remember enjoying those things as opposed to how they actually were. So like the music is very 80s, but is very like a modern 80s kind of thing, and like the acting and characters are very 80s, but it's all through this modern lens. So it sort of has this foot in both camps. And yeah, so I think that's the reason why it works so well, even though it's heavily drawn from the 80s, because it doesn't try to copy the 80s. It tries to copy what we feel we remember about these works.
Yeah, and I think if they did it in a more modern sense, you know, with cell phones and all this technology and everything, the story wouldn't have been nearly as interesting, and it wouldn't been as sort of difficult to find Will as it was, because, you know, we see the kids with the walkie-talkies and everything, and then, you know, in episode 6, Nancy and Jonathan decide that they're going to go after the monster themselves, and they just sort of go to an army surplus store or something like that and buy a bunch of supplies. So they're doing this with, you know, sort of the bare necessities here, and I think that's sort of what makes it so much more entertaining. And especially since, you know, we don't live in a time where, you know, kids should just be going out riding their bikes from sunrise to well after dark and everything, and we see these kids doing that, and it's sort of like you start to remember how things were, because even when I was younger, and this was, you know, in the 90s,
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't as big of a deal to be playing around outside and everything. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
now now if you see a kid walking around by themselves, you're kind of like, what is this kid doing, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And you never really get that with this show because it's not meant to be set in the present day and everything. And you know, it kind of makes you nostalgic for a time where you could just go around with your friends playing these games, you know, having walkie-talkies and everything. And it's sort of like, this show made people wish these were things you could still go outside and do on a regular basis instead of being so plugged into everything and on social media all the time. At least that's what it made me feel. And I think, you know, that's something that people need right now. And, you know, it's like all of us are so plugged in all the time that even though we had to be plugged in to watch this show, it sort of takes you out of that space for a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, and it's great that it's sort of set in this time when they don't have a lot of these modern comforts. Because if it was true to like a modern reality, we would just have a show where we'd see mostly the tops of characters' heads because they're just staring down at their phones, and that might not be as fun of a watch as them actually looking up and being aware of their environments, which is sort of, I think what was good about those 80s shows is that those characters were more aware of things that were happening around them.
Yeah, and the Duffer Brothers are the ones who are really behind this show and sort of made this happen, and that would be Matt Duffer and Ross Duffer. And they, you know, directed most of the episodes. I think they directed 6 out of the 8, and then they even wrote the first 2 episodes themselves. So they were very hands-on with this, and I think they did such a good job with it that it would kind of be hard for them to hand it off to someone else at this point, because, you know, a lot of times we see that with network shows. You don't necessarily have the same writers or directors for every episode of a network show. In fact, you probably rarely do. I know there are writers who will, you know, kind of rotate in and out for network shows and everything like that. But I think that's one of the unique things about these Netflix shows. It's typically, you know, whoever has the idea is sort of the one who gets to run with it. And they don't really have to feel obligated to hand it off because you can do 8 episodes instead of a 20 plus episode season like you see with network television. And I think that gives them a lot more room to work with, even though it's a lot less time to work with.
And I think also what's important about having sort of, as you said, the same personnel staying on. I think part of the reason that things tend to, if not be worse, than just be different when sort of power is changing hands, is because with a thing that's so sense-driven and vibe-driven and visceral as a TV show and just so multifaceted, you can't possibly, let me think, you can't communicate to somebody else all the driving factors that are playing into your choices, whether it's like setting or dialogue, because a lot of it could be based on sort of abstract thought that you can't get across, and that's what makes this person uniquely qualified to be the one helming the show and making it great. So it's just very hard to change hands, because you can't hand over everything if you don't exactly know everything that you're handing over. I can't put it into words if that wasn't a convoluted mess of a statement there.
Yeah, and while I mentioned earlier there hasn't been much revealed about season 2, I just want to go over some of these episode titles very quickly, because, you know, the first episode title for season 2 is Mad Max. So anyone who is familiar with, you know, Mad Max the movies and everything, they're going to be like, oh, I wonder what that could mean, because it's a totally different style and just different story from Mad Max. You're like, okay, where are we going? And then episode 2, you have The Boy Who Came Back to Life, which presumably would be about Will and being stuck in the Upside Down and everything.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have, a few places in here. You have the pumpkin patch, the palace, you have the secret cabin for episode 7. And then for the season finale, you have the lost brother. And it's like, okay, so is, Jonathan going to go missing now, or is this still about Will, or what have you? And I think even if some of these episode titles change, which they probably will, just because, like I said earlier, they don't want to give too much away, that's still something that people will start generating a bunch of theories on. And, it's like, okay, we don't even have a clue where they're going to go with this, but just those episode titles alone kind of give you some food for thought. And you're like, okay, I can see them doing this. I could see them going here with this. And, what if they have Jonathan go missing at the end of season 2 instead of Will going missing again? And, I think the Duffer Brothers have so much just within these episode titles alone to work with for season 2. And that's not even counting what they've already thought of and what has been written so far.
It's, I don't know. I don't tend to put too much stake into episode titles per se. I think just because a lot of times they're intentionally cryptic. Like, I know with the Breaking Bad a lot, it was that way, where like you would only realize the meaning of the title after you notice some sort of small element in the episode. So while I do think these titles do definitely make sense and lean towards some larger truth about what is going on, I don't know. I guess it's hard to say or give any concrete thoughts as to what's going to happen based on those.
Yeah, and if you sort of look at the season 1 episode titles, it's like they make so much more sense now because we've already seen everything and what happened. But, episode 3 was titled Holly Jolly, and that was, the Christmas light episode with Will sort of spelling out a message for his mom and everything. And there is no way you could have seen that coming just from reading episode titles. So it's sort of, something that some critics will take and run with it. But like you said, I don't want to put too much thought into it right now, just because it does state that some of them will change. So it's like, okay, then you're like, which ones are they going to change? And what is that going to mean? And it's just way too much to dive into. And obviously, super fans of the show probably have no problem doing that, because I feel like this is easily going to become such a big series in general. They already have the Funko toys for Stranger Things, and with season 2 they'll probably have a second wave of those, and they already have multiple ones of 11. They have one of just her, and then I think they have one with her and the Egos, and they're definitely very invested in this series, and I think that is definitely a good sign for it moving forward. And a lot of people just love the kids in general and outside of the show too. So I think they definitely hit it out of the park with this first season, and hopefully they can continue to build on it for season 2 and hopefully more seasons to come after that.
Yeah, and sort of go off what you were just saying, part of the reason that I think the show did so well and is doing so well and will probably carry on doing well in its next season is because it's very marketable, not in terms of just what it is, but as you said, in terms of these kids like going on late night or making these funny, crazy online videos or dancing and singing at award shows. It's just that this main crew of kids, they're very engaging. They're very click worthy online. So yeah, I think like half of the show's hype is basically what happens outside of the show, and that's sort of just a function of how TV and online culture work today. And but what brings it over the top is that these sort of charismatic personalities outside of the show bring you into this show that is very different from them, but just very high quality.
Yeah, and I think it helps that the kids are so likable and everything outside of the show, and they're just as excited about this as the viewers are. I don't think any of them were expecting it to be this huge, especially, when you're a kid, you don't really have expectations for too many things. It's like you sort of want video games and that sort of thing. And if you don't get a video game, you're disappointed for a bit, but then you find something else and move on. And, these kids probably felt the same way about acting. It's like, okay, cool. We have something to work on. And, if it didn't work out, they're still so young that it wasn't going to be a career ender or anything. And then to have it come out as big as it did, they were probably just like, oh, wow, this is huge. And I'm sure it took some time for it to sink in. And I think they've all handled it so well because, like you said, they've been on late night shows. I saw some of them have parts in other TV shows and everything. And it's like they've handled it better than a lot of child stars have. And, hopefully they don't get to the point that we've seen with a lot of child stars who, sort of went off the rails and everything later in life. So it'll be interesting to see, obviously, how that plays out outside of the show as well. And I think, with this being a Netflix show, it's obviously handled differently than Disney shows and that sort of thing. So I think, I'm hoping at least that these kids will be totally fine down the road and, continue to go on and have great careers even outside of this, like many of the Harry Potter stars have.
Well, yeah, I think at this point, they're just excited, A, to have a job, and B, to have it be doing very well. Like, I know Barb, I'm blanking on the name of the actress, but this was actually her first credited role, like, in anything. So this is just like this big, huge shock for her that, like, her first role in TV or movies or whatever is just taking off in this way, and that it's leading to these other roles. And while this may not be like the very first role for these other kids, it's, I would assume, just based on their age, one of the earliest projects in their career, and it's doing very well, and they just seem very thankful about it at this point.
Yeah, and I think even for Winona Ryder, it's a big role for her because,
True.
she's done stuff, but she hasn't done anything that's really been a huge role by any means, at least from my memory. And, like I said, with all of the outside influences on the show, the Funko bobbleheads and everything, I even went to a friend's art show and they had a separate room that was entirely a Stranger Things gallery. And, I bought a piece of art that is, the monster from the Upside Down grabbing Barb off of the, the diving board. And
there you go.
I was like, oh, okay. So this, is going to spur a lot of different types of creative projects outside of the show. And, these weren't well-known artists by any means. It was a bunch of people sort of local to where I live and everything. And they were doing these amazing art pieces for this show because not only do just regular viewers love it, critics have loved it, artists have loved it, and it sort of spawns all of these other things outside of that. And obviously, Funko would have been pretty dumb to not have done a Stranger Things line. And it's not too often that you necessarily see that with these Netflix shows. Obviously, with Marvel, that's a different thing because that's a huge company teaming up with Netflix. But when you have something like The Get Down, I haven't seen any toys or anything spawn from that series. So it's sort of like they have something unique on their hands here.
Well, I think it sort of boils down to, based on everything we've said before, how these characters are fun to watch. The show looks great. It sounds great. All the mania surrounding it is fun. What we have is just a show that, for various reasons and pretty much every angle you want to view it from, is very easy to love. Whether you're a viewer or an actor or a director or an artist watching it, there's just very few reasons to not like it.
Yeah. And I think obviously I'll be impatiently awaiting season 2, but do you think you will be covering season 2 for Nerdist again? Is that something you want to do?
Stranger Things pays the bills, so absolutely. I'll write about it I'll write about it for as long as I keep getting checks in the mail. But yeah, I enjoy it though. It was fun to write about just because of all the mania and fandom surrounding it. There's always something to write about, and then there's always going to be people who want to read about it. So it's pretty convenient for me in terms of work.
Yeah, and on that note, are there any final thoughts you have about the show? I'm just really looking forward to season 2 and sort of how that plays out right now.
Not really beyond what we said. I guess the only thing that we haven't talked about that I am curious about and really wanting to see in the next season is Brett Gelman's character. He's always very funny. He could bring a sort of more humorous element to the show, which was, I mean, it had like some sort of humor at times, a little bit, but he's just like an actually very funny guy. So I'm curious to see what he's going to bring.
Yeah, because, like we said earlier, they have added some characters for season 2, and they've bumped some characters up to main character roles and everything. And obviously we'll see more of Will. At least it would be crazy for us not to see more of Will, considering,
exactly.
He was the whole reason for this happening, and the whole reason they even had this sort of story and adventure to begin with. And I think I'm just sort of excited for something that can take you out of the present day and just engulf you in this different world, even if it's only for 8-9 hours or something like that. And I feel like with some of these Marvel shows and everything that Netflix is doing, it's not quite the same effect, simply because these are superheroes, and I mean, obviously the Upside Down would probably never be real, but there are, sort of creatures and everything that can do damage to people. So I feel like while Stranger Things isn't totally realistic, the characters themselves are realistic. Like the people in the show are realistic, as opposed to, having Luke Cage, who is a bulletproof man and that sort of thing. So I think, these kids are very relatable, and, you can have adults looking back on this show and being like, yeah, I remember when we used to do those things and that sort of thing. So I think they have a wide audience here as well. And I think that's going to help them a lot going forward.
Yeah, pretty much. And like with the Marvel shows, you have unrealistic characters dealing with an unrealistic world, but in this show you got realistic characters dealing with this crazy world. So it's sort of another door that's easier for you to walk through and sort of more easily identify with these characters. And I think that's part of the reason why it's easy for us to get absorbed, because we can see them as a lens for us to look through and experience all this madness that you wouldn't expect to happen. Yeah,
exactly. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I'll probably have to have you back on so we can talk about season 2 later in the year, because especially if you're going to write about it, that's, obviously you'll have a lot of thoughts on it then too.
Yeah, exactly. This was a lot of fun. Thanks. I'm down.
Awesome. And to our listeners, as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.